Leona?
Yes, and it's back to me. We're going to go ahead and do a quick question. In the bottom corner, you should see an A, B, C, D. We would like to see who is on the call with us. So if we can get folks to check, A, you're a lawyer, B, you're a domestic violence or sexual assault victim advocate, C, a mental health professional, or D, other. Go ahead and, oh wow, they're coming in really quickly. So it looks as if B is holding strong. We have quite a bit at 60% and still rising, domestic violence and sexual assault victim advocate. And I also noticed that some folks are also putting it in the chat. So
that's great. So we've got about 20% lawyers, and then we have about 12% mental health people from the mental health or healthcare professional community, and then about 7% of you are from other disciplines. Please let us know where you're from, what other kinds of disciplines are represented here. It helps us make sure we are catering or addressing this webinar to the needs of the audience.
Leona, here we go. So these are the learning objectives for today. To better understand how to develop collaborative relationship to build trust with immigrant survivors, develop a survivor story for VAWA, U, or T visa immigration applications using a trauma-informed approach, and engage in self-care when developing a survivor story for VAWA, U, or T visa immigration applications. I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. And this, once again, is an ABCD question. Have you had any experience developing a VAWA self-petition, U visa, or T visa affidavit or declaration? And I'm going to make sure that we are sharing. And it looks as if, wow, they're coming in really quickly. Hey, no experience.
Leona, can you post the percentages again?
Let me see.
There we go.
There we go.
So around half of you have not actually worked on affidavits in the past, and about half of you, you have some experience, mostly around, it looks like VAWA it looks like mostly around, what's D?
D is experience in VAWA, U visa, or T visa story development.
Good. So it's about half and half. That's really great from our perspective. Our goal was to reach one of the things that we're really interested in encouraging people to do is develop collaborations between advocates and attorneys working on these cases, and involve advocates potentially more in the assistance on the story collection that we're going to be talking today. So that it's really good. Those of you that are advocates, you'll gain some skills that will help you work better with the attorneys, or for those of you in jurisdictions that don't have access to attorneys, potentially build some skills to help the clients yourself. Marianne? Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So we'll begin by talking in terms of this trauma-informed approach to do the petitions with what is probably the most important part of the whole thing, which is developing the collaborative relationship. So I know that advocates know this better than almost anyone, but talking about it from a trauma perspective is slightly different than a collaborative relationship otherwise, because it requires holding a lot more than just any other kind of context. So the first point here really is that the empathy and the warm connection in the attunement to where the client is really, really critical. So how does one know? What does attunement really mean? It really means trying to get a sense, and almost in a feeling way, where the client is as he or she is sitting in front of you in that very moment. So it's not where they are generally or how they feel about this whole approach or this prospect, but what is their experience right in that moment. And so that helps, knowing that helps pace the interaction, it helps pace the interview, it helps in terms of determining what kind of response and what kind of support is necessary. And it requires that the advocate or the interviewer really tune into their own body, their own sense of awareness, so that one can actually use that as a tool. The second point here is obviously attention to safety and ongoing risk. If someone is having some sense of current risk, current danger, then that's going to cloud and color almost everything she or he says or reports about. And so I don't spend a lot of time on that because, again, advocates know that very well. But just to recognize that any sense of danger or risk to oneself, but also, let's say, to one's children or family, is really important to recognize and obviously deal with as a priority before moving on to almost anything else. So the relationship requires building. Relationship with any kinds of clients require building, and certainly when one is working with a client who has a trauma history, has experiences that are in many ways difficult to talk about, difficult even to remember. And one of the most important things to remember here is the non-judgment, that even experiences that are shameful and embarrassing and sometimes humiliating to say out loud have to be held with a certain amount of non-judgment for them to even be able to be tolerated by the person telling them. And so cultivating a sense of being able to listen and in a way that's empathic and non-judgmental is really, really critical. At the same time, it requires that we, as those of us sometimes doing these interviews, also honor our own experience and our own expertise, so that we can't be expected to just absorb everything we hear without any kind of an effect. So requiring that sense of tuning into ourselves as well as tuning into the client in front of us is an important balance. Acknowledging what we don't know helps build trust, because clients know and can sense when we don't know what it is we're talking about. And so whatever that might be about in the interaction, simply acknowledging human conditions of, I don't know about that, or I want to know more about that, but I don't really know much about that, when that becomes an obvious issue. And then the boundary issue is important here, because while the interviewer may have be able to relate to the experiences that the client's talking about, maybe it has experienced some of the very same experiences, maybe not, having a sense of, I can hold this for you, I can hold this with you, this experience, this reporting, this telling with you, without myself being swept up by it, becomes such an important way of building trust. Because if a client has to be fearful of taking care of the interviewer, because as she or he reports her story, the interviewer becomes so upset and so visibly caught up in their own reaction, then it doesn't become a very trusting environment. It becomes a place where the client has to monitor and track her own reporting, just as a way of taking care of the interviewer.
Marianne?
So yes.
If I can just make one point on the confidentiality protections for a moment. The other thing that's important for people to understand, particularly those of you that may not be immigration lawyers, is that there are special privacy and confidentiality protections that apply in VAWA self-petitioning cases, T visa and U visa cases, that really are very different than like what we might see in family court, where if somebody comes to testify, the perpetrator can actually hear the testimony and potentially intimidate the witness. Here, everything is sealed with very few exceptions. And so there's an extra level of confidentiality and safety protection built into these cases that people should be aware of. And we have lots of materials on our website, which is www.newapplibrary.wcl.american.edu, and it's on the link is on in the PowerPoint presentations. Back to you, Marianne.
Mm-hmm. That's really very important, because if the client knows that although this will go into a petition, that petition won't be available to all parties and who knows who else, that certainly helps with a sense of trust. So the next slide really goes back to the basic definitions of trauma and trauma-informed. Can we have the next slide, number 10?
Marianne, if you hit the down arrow, it'll go.
Oh, I can do it myself.
Yes, you're in charge.
Very nice. Well, okay. All right, so just briefly here, what are we talking about anyway? Well, what is trauma? Trauma is really considered to be some kind of event or experience, usually, that overwhelms the person's ability to adapt or cope in effective ways. And there's obviously a lot of stressful life events that people are exposed to. And the distinction between stressful events and traumatic events typically is referred to as, again, where the individual's ability to cope or adapt to that event breaks down in some way, that it's just overwhelming to the individual. And so what is, therefore, trauma-informed care or trauma-informed advocacy in this case? Well, that's really when the advocacy or the intervention or the working with the client is informed by really two things: understanding those traumatic experiences. What are they? What was the experience? What is that? What does that really mean? And also, importantly, holding and understanding and responding to the individual with an understanding of the effects of that traumatic experience and how those effects may influence the relationship with the advocate, how they may influence the client's behaviors in working with the petition. Just as an example, someone may come in, seek help, and then disappear for a while. And it may be that the avoidance of not wanting to confront or deal is really part of the whole traumatic experience. And so there are lots of ways to understand clients' behavior through a trauma-informed lens. And understanding the relationship to the advocacy and the advocacy process, the immigration process altogether is also can be informed by that perspective. Okay, I think I'm finished. No.
Mercedes? Mercedes?
Okay, now one of the most important or the most critical parts of the process in a relationship is building trust. It's very important to build trust before you can begin to work with the client, with the survivor. You have to reassure the survivor that they can trust you, that they can talk about their most traumatic experiences. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's important to take a trauma-informed approach, sensitive to the victim's trauma history, so that they're able to talk about it. As Marianne said previously, it's very critical to have a non-judgmental attitude, to not be judgmental. They may tell you things that you're not used to hearing, and so we have to make sure that we keep our biases within ourselves and not let them know how we feel, even about the trauma that they're expressing to us, because it is difficult. Especially if you do this every day, you're going to be listening to stories that you're not used to. They're not part of your own life. And so we have to be able to not be judgmental. We also have to remind survivors of the confidentiality within our relationship. If you are an attorney working with a client or a paralegal, working with a survivor, then it's important that they know that you do have that privilege, that confidentiality. But also express to them the importance and that they do have a relationship of confidentiality with the other service providers that they're working with. One of the things that we've done is we've worked sometimes with therapists or other advocates that they're working with in order to gain their story, and we'll see this throughout the presentation. However, they need to know that there is confidentiality with each provider that they're working with. And as well as the VAWA confidentiality protections for the immigration benefits that they're seeking. And so that's very important too, because sometimes they're afraid to tell us some of these experiences or some of these things that they've been through. They may be embarrassed. They may not want to express some of the things that have happened to them because they're afraid that something will happen to their abuser, which we know that's very common. However, they need to know that they need to be reassured that there are confidentiality protections in place with the applications that they are submitting. Be mindful of nonverbal cues. Nonverbal cues can tell you a lot. They can express so much with an expression, a movement, a look, and so be mindful of that. Oftentimes, you will know that there is something else that they may need to tell you just by some of their nonverbal cues. We've noticed this with survivors of sexual abuse. Sometimes we're working with a survivor working on domestic violence, on a domestic violence case, and they may never have mentioned sexual abuse. However, when you're working on their story, and if you are mindful of their nonverbal cues, you may realize that there was sexual abuse. And so this is very important to be mindful of that, to know that that is something else, that's another form of communication. And of course, be sensitive to their cultural differences. That's very important. Again, we tend to make judgments based on our own biases and our own lives. But be mindful that they're not the same. And so we have to take that into consideration as well when working with survivors. Hey, Leslie, on to you.
Thank you. So some of you are maybe working on these cases on your own. Others may be collaborating with advocates. Some people might be in a position, probably less of you, where there might be a therapist who can assist or some other person. Going back to the bottom left where it says feedback, can you check A, B, C, or D, whether you're doing this yourself, whether you're working with an advocate, a therapist, or another person? And if it's another person, if you could tell us in the chat who you're working with. So it looks like numbers are coming in. Take a minute. It looks like it looks like just over like 55, between 55 and 60% of you are doing this on your own. The largest group of people with whom people are collaborating are advocates. And the second largest, actually co-equal, are people that are doing with other people. And some of those other people include therapists, immigration attorneys, people might be working on civil rights issues with people providing support in civil rights, but it seems like if you're an advocate, they seem to be working with attorneys and attorneys with advocates. That's great. And sometimes there are therapists available as well. Great. So back to Marianne.
Okay. So in terms of developing the story, developing the client's history of immigration and of abuse and the whole story, we obviously need to identify and develop the trauma story, importantly. So the whole purpose for focusing on trauma is because with certain of the provisions, the experience of violence and abuse becomes central to the petition itself. And there are certain traumas that are those violence and abuse types of experiences. And there are other kinds of traumas that help explain or understand, to some extent, the survivor's own experience and explain some of her behavior. They explain some of the choices that she or he makes. And it just provides a context for understanding this person and why they are behaving and or experiencing things as they do. So one of the very first principles, if you will, in identifying the traumatic experience is really knowing why you're interested in the trauma anyway, what you're going to do with that information. And so that's important to convey to the client, because otherwise it can feel as though one is being sort of laid open, if you will, one's whole life. And in many ways, this is the process. But knowing that there's a reason why this is so, and with compassion, explaining that this will help understand your client's experience. This will help explain certain of her effects in her experience, and so it's important in that respect. Now, many clients have really very complex and extensive traumatic histories, and there's a balance here in terms of how much detail is necessary. And certainly, knowing a lot of detail is important for developing the story and the petition, but there's a balance between a point at which it almost feels or could feel like it's becoming gratuitous. So understanding and getting a sense of how much is necessary is a kind of skill that can be honed over time. I'm sure for those of you who've done this know what I'm talking about. And it's also the case that one doesn't always get the details all in one fell swoop. And so sometimes it's enough just to talk about that there was a rape, for example, or that there was sexual abuse. And the extent to which the survivor may be able to provide more of those details of actually what happened, for some people they can't go further at that moment, and it requires coming back and revisiting the story. A third point that's really important here, and I think Mercedes, you mentioned this before, which is for some people this is the very first time they will have disclosed this information to anyone, or there's a piece of the story or the piece of the trauma that they've never told anyone. And the impact of that can often be really huge. And it can be hugely relieving and supportive and healing if that information is held with the kind of recognition and acknowledgement and honoring of that's suited to that situation, which is they're sharing with you for the very first time this tremendous, often what's felt like a secret, a shame, a piece of their story and life that they haven't felt comfortable or safe telling anybody else up to this point. And so we have to meet that experience with one understanding that's what's happening. Sometimes we don't know, but as Mercedes mentioned, also reading or noticing the nonverbal cues can help us know how it is they're offering their story, how difficult it is to say these things out loud. And so recognizing that it may be the first time. And often people will tell you, I've never told anyone this before. Another really important principle to understand is that disclosing the trauma can actually put one in a place where they're feeling it all over again. So it can trigger emotions, it can trigger memories, it can trigger traumatic reactions. And so pacing the storytelling by taking breaks, by checking in with how's the person doing, by debriefing at the end, can help with that But sometimes it just happens that the triggers, we light on a trigger. And I remember one example many years ago when I was working with an attorney, and she called me to help because as the woman was telling her story, she literally was reliving the experience of being set on fire. Her arm was set on fire. And she wasn't in that attorney's office. She was as if she was in that place in her home where her husband had done this to her. And so we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what to do in those situations, but one needs to know and to know that you have these skills to be able to respond when someone becomes triggered or becomes, is it termed, dysregulated. They can't regulate their own emotions, and even in this extreme example, don't really know they're right here and now, and it's actually safe right now. They're just telling a story as opposed to feeling as if it's happening all over again. More often people in their retelling just become emotionally upset. And so knowing how to ground someone, how to calm someone becomes an important part of the toolkit. In addition to being a lawyer and an advocate, one has to, this is part of, I think, that role as well. Okay, Leslie, I think you're on.
Okay. So just to get some feedback from those of you that are participating, first of all, I want to tell you we have topped our all-time high in webinars. There are 380 of you on the phone today. Highest to date was 325, so really glad you're here joining us today. And so what I'd like to do is ask you, for those of you that have worked with victims, obtaining their stories, and when we say stories, that's how we're talking about them, Dave, for the affidavits that people developed for VAWA, T, and U visa cases. What have you used that you feel has been successful to date? What has worked well for you? Can some of you provide us some thoughts on that, and I can report them back to the group? You should use the text chat to respond. I stunned you. Nobody's responding. Oh, there we go. So getting an immigration lawyer involved, some of you using the power and control wheel, that can be very helpful. Marianne, do you want to comment on that?
I think that one of the most powerful things about using something like the power and control wheel is that it validates the experience. It's like, that's it. That's what I went through. And so it could be the power and control wheel. It could be a set of structured questions. But it's as if you know if you know enough to ask, have I gone through this, then how did you know that? Or why is this written there? That's my experience. And for some people, it's as if that was just happening to them. And so it validates that it's not just happening to them, even though it obviously did happen to them. It somehow takes it out of the very personal, it was just me.
Right, and one of the things that we're seeing people talking about, and this is where actually we're moving into next, is some people have found that having people write their story, listening to it with open-ended questions, not interrupting, giving her some space to be able to provide it, writing down the experience, those are all the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in more detail today. Marianne?
Yes. So quite some time ago, Leslie and I were talking about all of this, and
you'll need to move the slide down. There we go.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And the idea that there's a particular intervention for dealing with trauma, healing trauma, really, that very much is aligned with the process of developing a petition in an immigration case. And that is essentially to develop the trauma story, be exposed to it, and to have to sort of live with it in a lot of detail until the story, someone mentioned, why don't we just calling it her experience or her life experiences or something like that. Why having to live with it in a way that is up close and very personal. Instead of just putting it on the shelf thinking about it once in a while, never thinking about it, and so forth. So what is this? So there's a writing intervention that's often used in the mental health world. Sometimes there are adaptations of this actually that are online interventions. Sometimes they're in person. They're incorporated into some cognitive behavior therapy approaches for treating PTSD. And so there's an opportunity here to use the development of her story, and I don't mean by that to minimize the experience, but to develop her personal life story in a way that can enhance the healing that other people are already mentioning as one way to use as a strategy to help. And so what is that? Let's talk first about the process, and we'll go into more detail in just a bit. But the process of the writing is essentially having her, or him, be able to get it out in a way that it is held with reverence, it's held with respect, it's held with non-judgment, and it's held in a way that's not edited or changed initially. That is, there's a certain amount of witnessing, a certain amount of just being able to get it out, a certain amount of telling that becomes part of the process of healing. It enables one to process the trauma. And so the writing intervention that we've been talking about, adapting it to the advocacy petition for the immigration petition, very much mimics what many of you as advocates already do. And maybe with knowing and maybe not so much knowing that you're potentially also facilitating healing. And so the process is really helping her get her story out, the trauma history, the full story. And why does this work, we could ask ourselves. And the true answer to that is, even in the scientific literature, nobody actually understands fully the mechanisms. Some people have suggested that the process of exposure is what helps the healing. Other research actually has said, no, it's not really just exposure to the traumatic story. So we're not quite sure, but we do know that the getting it out, the writing it, the being exposed to one's own story in a coherent narrative, and maybe that's also part of it, which is there develops a kind of coherence to the narrative that may not have been there prior to putting it all together in essentially my story. So I have this fragment or that fragment, and I remember this, and that's happened to me also. But by putting it into a coherent narrative, it helps to organize the experience. It helps to name it. And there's a saying in the trauma world, if you can name it, you can tame it. And so all of these parts of the process are thought to be why it is that writing down the story can be very healing.
Ladies? Mercedes?
Okay. Leslie, can we bring down the next slide? I can't get it.
You can't move it? Okay.
I got it. Thank you. Okay. The survivor story. You may wonder why we use the word story. In no way are we undermining the seriousness of the experience or the importance of the story by calling it a story. We tend to think, and we've seen this throughout the years and in working with survivors, that when we say affidavit, they tend to look at it as more of a formal document without any feelings. However, when we talk to them about their story, we're talking to them about their life experience, their cycle of abuse that they lived. And this is why we're using the word story, but in no way are we undermining the importance of it or the seriousness of the document. we know that the survivor story or the affidavit is the most important piece of evidence submitted. Oftentimes we don't have any other paper evidence that we submit. We submit an affidavit, and it has to be a very strong affidavit. Their story has to be very strong, because it's an opportunity for DHS to hear directly from the survivor in her own voice. And that's why it's so important to let them know that this is a document where, or this is somewhere where they are expressing what they have lived. And so and I will be going back and forth as to story and affidavit, but this is why we refer to it as the story. With this story, with this document, the adjudicator should be able to understand and feel what the survivor has felt after being subjected to abuse or crime victimization. And how do they feel this? They feel this through the voice of the survivor. We do not change the voice, even when we do translation of the document into English, when we work with non-English speaking clients. We keep their voice. We keep their experience. What I tell the survivors that I work with, what we tell them is that we want them to have the adjudicator live through what they lived through, so that they can understand that the relationship that they lived through was abusive. It was traumatic for them. And so this is why we tend to always call it the story instead of the affidavit. We make it less formal. As I explained before, they are more apt to expressing their feelings. They're more apt to talking about what happened to them, and they open up a little bit more. Okay. And what is a survivor? What is required when writing this story? The next slide has a chart on what is required for the VAWA self-petition. What do you want them to include in their story when you're working on a VAWA self-petition? Their marital or familial relationship, and develop that relationship. Oftentimes we know that we don't have paper evidence to demonstrate that they had a good faith marriage. And so what their story that they're going to tell you, they're going to talk about, I always tell them, talk about the good things as well as the bad. Tell me when you fell in love. What happened? How did that relation flourish? And then talk about what started happening. And this helps develop the good faith in the relationship, because they're expressing their feelings as well as events that have occurred. You're also in a VAWA self-petition. We're also describing substantial harm of abuse endured, of the extreme cruelty and the lasting effects. So as we develop their story, as we're working with them, we're developing what were the effects of the abuse. What happened to them? What happened to their children? How did they feel about that? Because it's very important to inject throughout the story their feelings. That's how we can tell what abuse is. I always use the example. If I hit you on the leg, is that abuse? It may be. However, the way that you feel it is, the way you perceive it can be determinative of whether or not it was abuse. And so we use these types of examples to work with the client. One, it helps to build that relationship, but it also helps us to develop the elements that we need to prove our petition. For the U and the T visa, in developing their stories, we talk about the crime. We have them describe the things that happened to them and how they were helpful. They may say, I didn't go to court, but there may be other ways that they were helpful. Did they talk to anyone? And sometimes while developing their story, we are developing how they were helpful to the investigation. We also, again, as in the VAWA self-petition, we develop their substantial harm or the abuse that they endured, the extreme cruelty, and the lasting effects. And so this is why it is important, as we talked about before, to develop that relationship. We have to be mindful that this may not happen on the first, second, or third interview with the client. It may take several interviews with the client to be able to develop that relationship, to be able to develop that trust, and to be able to get all the elements of their story in order to present a very effective and a very strong application. Now, also we must prepare for their story collections. One of the things that we do, it's important to do your homework, and one of the things that you do is you read the police reports, read the protection orders, the petitions. Those can tell you a lot. It's read pleadings in custody cases, in dissolution cases, review the medical records, any other evidence that they present to you by reading them, whether they're reports from the dependency court or from the Department of Children and Families or anything that is related to their case. Read them before you interview the client, because this will give you a sense of the types of questions that you can ask and where you can even concentrate to ask more questions or to have them develop the rest of the story. The petition for the protection order, I have found, gives you a wealth of information because they have to express that they are in fear of imminent danger. And so this is where you can obtain a starting point. This can be a starting point to develop the rest of the story. It's important to carefully describe to the client what the story collection session will entail. Let them know that this may be a traumatic experience. Let them feel comfortable in telling you when they need to stop. Explain to them what the steps will be in developing the story. One of the things that we do is you might have them write something before they come in to meet with you. We provide our clients with a guide so that they can start writing their story in their own words, and that, along with the other documents that we read, are a starting point for us to develop the story further. Important, make sure that you set aside enough time. There have been interviews that have taken 2 hours, 1 hour, but we've had interviews that have taken up to 6 and 8 hours, because once they start, they do not want to end. They want to get it over with. And we've had them tell us that. And so it's easier for them to just talk about it in one session. So prepare for that as well. Set aside enough time in order to be able to do this, because it's a time-consuming task. It's something where you have to dedicate your time. You have to give them empathy. You have to be able to work with them at their pace. You cannot rush the session. It has to be at the survivor's pace. And he or she has to be able to tell you their experience in the steps that they feel comfortable in.
Okay, so the next slide we talk about the other thing we want to do as we're preparing is you want to make sure that you've thought about interpretation issues, that you've worked in advance and thought about how you're going to work with the survivor so that ideally she can write the story in her own language. You can have interpreters and available translators who can help you translate it, but it's very important that the interpreters and translators that you work with also ideally receive domestic violence and sexual assault training, have interpreter training, and possibly even some trauma training. So you need to think creatively about those resources and what is available. Now for the next remainder, we've got about 40 minutes left in the webinar, and we're going to focus now on the actual nuts and bolts of how we're recommending that you approach this. We see it in 3 parts. The first part is a situation in which you're creating an environment, and Marianne will be talking about that in a minute, to help the victim tell the story and write the story herself, essentially uninterrupted. That's part 1. Part 2 will be an opportunity. It's a more structured interview where the kinds of questions that Mercedes was talking about, the kinds of things you think of while she's telling the story, there's a follow-up for. And we've created 2 tools for you. One is to help her get the story, to help guide her through the story process, and for you to use as a note-taking guide for the follow-up that you want to do in the structured interview. And then the second is a structured interview tool, of which you're getting essentially part 1 as part of this webinar. which will be some of the follow-up questions that you might ask to get the kind of detail that Mercedes was talking about. And then we're going to have another webinar in a month or two, probably 2 months, where we're going to go into more detail about how you can use particular questions that come out of some of the research history that Marianne's going to be talking about in a minute, to delve more deeply and make sure you're guide the survivor to being able to come forward with this story, ideally in a shorter period of time. And then finally, the third thing we're going to be concluding and talking about today is how you as the advocate or the lawyer pull that all together and then have the client essentially read it back to you in part 3 of this process, where she's verifying the information and essentially experiencing it again. And we're going to go through all of that in the remaining time today. Marianne?
Sure. Okay, so the next 2 slides will just be focusing on some of the key points about the first part of what Leslie just said, which is getting the story out and creating the context in which it's both safe, and physically safe, emotionally safe, and she's ready to do that. One of the key points here is remembering that in this story, the client is the expert. This is her story. Questions that elicit detail about what happened should be framed and should be understood to be just that. It's sometimes easy to sound like we're questioning what the client's saying when we ask, well, why did you do that? And as though it's, well, why did you do that? When in fact it's just, help me understand what your thinking was when you did that as a response, or something as an example. So we have to be very careful that we hold with a lot of appreciation that this is the client's story and it's her experience in the situation that matters more than anything else. Leslie mentioned before about the getting the story out in an uninterrupted way, and yet getting the story out in isolation and being alone can also be very traumatizing. And so the second point, writing the story without assistance, can lead to re-traumatization. I'm sure many of you, if you've actually done this, or have heard of cases in which a client was sent home to write her story and she didn't come back for a while. Perhaps tried to write it and it just became too hard, and then wanted to just avoid. And so if at all possible, from a therapeutic perspective at least, having some ability to create support and witnessing and a container for the story would be very, very helpful. Now that may mean the client sitting in front of you while she's writing the story, if she can write. It's also the case that, we'll get to this in the next slide, but that writing may not be the modality if she's not able to write the story for some reason. But getting the story out is really important. But it's also equally important that she not get it out with no support there to ground her, to hold the container, especially in the initial phase where it's just coming out. And as Mercedes indicated, sometimes when the door opens, the floodgate opens. And it's quite a emotionally taxing process to go through this, because it's almost a process that has a life of its own. In the first telling, in the first getting it out, just getting it out is the goal. So chronology, spelling, grammar, details that aren't forthcoming are not as important as an uninterrupted process of just the telling. The telling either writing or the telling in terms of literally telling. So in the writing, what's the role then of the advocate or the attorney or the counselor? It's a role really of supporting witnessing, and listening, holding the story in a way that the advocate is not himself becoming overwhelmed. So it requires being able to go into this session with a fair amount of resilience on our own part as the interviewers. If we're tired, hungry, dealing with our own stressful events right in that moment, we may not be so terribly able to hold this story in the way that it ideally needs to be held. Now, in some cases, survivors can't literally write their story. Either they're not literate in a language that can be useful to get the story out, or perhaps they're not literate in writing at all. And the point really, we've been talking about writing because that's what generally happens with the petitions, and there's this writing intervention. But the real healing has to do with expression of the story. And so for some clients, it may be that telling can be an expression that works just as well. And I noticed in the notes that some people were saying that they typed as the person told the story. If that's the case, it's probably important that it's not, well, here, stop, let me get this down right, or that it's an interrupting process, but it can be that the survivor is telling instead of writing. For other people, illustrating it through drawing or art can be part of the expression of the story. And those pictures, those drawings, can then become the basis to talk about what was happening in this picture. The picture may represent a person's experience, their feelings, or it may represent the actual event. It doesn't really matter. It's a representation that can then be a springboard to elaborating on the story. But the goal here is to provide an opportunity or a platform for the story to come out in an unedited way, not a comprehensive way. It will almost never come out in a comprehensive, straight line, chronology way with all the details. Trauma stories almost never come out like that. But it will be an emotional experience that allows a whole lot of the content to come out that can, as Leslie pointed out, can be ordered later in the process. Now, flexibility, I think, is the key here in finding out what works for the survivor that you're working with. It may be that this story is so difficult that for some, being alone in a private, safe place is absolutely critical to her sense of safety. In which case, it would be important to build in some safeguards there with checking in, making sure someone's there to be just a presence in the home, a safe, emotionally safe person, if not to be in the process of writing the story necessarily, but to be available. So it's not that there's absolutely one way that it always has to be, but the key ideas here are expression of the story, support of the person in that process, and to be able to get it out in a way that's not interrupted, which can often be interpreted as being corrected, somehow inadequate. And in any case, it just interrupts the emotional flow as the story comes out.
Okay. Leona?
Here I am. We're going to go ahead and do a discussion how writing interventions can improve development of the victim's story for her VAWA, T, or U visa application. And I thought I would start with Marianne. Marianne, from a trauma-informed perspective, could you give us a little bit of information about this?
Well, the writing intervention, which is laid out by Leslie, involves really developing the story over time in this way, allows for a couple of things. One, I think doing the pieces as this whole process involves gets out more of the story. It gets out more of the trauma more of the effect of the trauma and more of the context in which the trauma is occurring. And that context, again, may be prior traumas. So childhood histories of abuse, for example, that have nothing really to do with this perpetrator, this, particular violence and abuse, but it certainly may inform something about the story. So it gets more of more detail, more information. But I think importantly, it creates a coherent narrative. So it all makes sense in a way that perhaps it is not as easy to get to in some other ways.
Thank you for that. When I was doing direct practice myself and working with survivors that would eventually have to provide their story for their VAWA, their T or U visa application, one of the things that became really important was really making sure that the person who was gathering the information was aware of that trauma-informed perspective. And Leslie, how do you remember questions you did not ask because you were not interrupting? Because I know that sometimes can create anxiety for folks, that you want to respect the survivor and you want to be in this trauma-informed place, but you yourself also have a task that you need to accomplish.
Well, and that's why in the materials we actually created a tool that has a lot of details in it, the kinds of things you might want to ask as follow-up questions that you can use as a note-taking guide to write down make notes of your thoughts or circle a question you want to come back so that you want to ask, so that you have a place to write that down and memorialize it. Think about it after the interview as you prepare for stage 2 of where there's a more structured interview where you're asking the more detailed questions. So there is an opportunity to do it. You just need a tool or a mechanism so that you're not doing it during this first time when she's telling the story. So we created that for you to help in that process.
Thank you for that. And Mercedes, I really think the audience would be interested in your perspective as a practitioner and any approaches that you could give as an example to help guide and inform this discussion.
Okay, we have found that when we do not use the interventions, the story that we get from the client is not sufficient and it's not strong enough for the immigration case. And so therefore, by using the interventions, we build a stronger case. We're able to be more effective, and the story is no longer very general. It's very detailed, and it's filled with emotion, which is very important. And so that's why it's critical for us to use this method. One of the things that we found is that sometimes it's okay not to submit the application without the affidavit, because this way it gives us time to build that relationship with the client, with the survivor, to be able to at a later date develop a more effective affidavit or a more effective story to make their application stronger.
Thank you, Mercedes. And Marianne, we're just going to go on to you now and give a little bit more detail on immigration story writing intervention method part 2.
Right. So as Leslie mentioned before, if I understand this right, Leslie, we'll review this now, but we will have another webinar that goes a lot more in depth about how to do this part 2. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, the tool you have today focuses, the tool for part 2 you have today focuses on the kinds of questions that you need to fill out the immigration case with some trauma-informed questions, but a tool we're actually developing and testing a tool that we're going to roll out in the next webinar that will actually go into detail in some of these standardized tools that Marianne is going to give you a little bit of an overview now. And Marianne, we have about 25 minutes left.
Okay. So let me just do it, as you say, an overview of this. So in the part 2, the goal in essentially this part 2 is to follow up the open-ended story with more focused, structured questions that help elaborate the story and that identify areas potentially where a victim may not have or a survivor may not have remembered, because memory is one of the things that trauma does to the brain, which is a bit like Swiss cheese. Sometimes events are remembered and then they're lost and then they're remembered again. And so the purpose really of part 2 is to get more in-depth information and to screen for potentially other incidents or events that the survivor may not have thought to mention because she or he may not have thought it was particularly relevant, even though it might be. And so the screening tool I guess this is the part 1 screening tool that you're referring to, Leslie, is available on the website, and you can see the link there. So the goals of the interview itself, and this is kind of the overall goal, it's not limited to part 2. One is to develop essentially an emotional safety plan ahead of time for generating a story. And Mercedes, you mentioned before that you might meet with the client 2 or 3, 4 times before really jumping much into the story. And so what is an emotional safety plan? It might well be literally talking with the client about what she or he can do if they start to feel particularly upset in remembering the story. So it's really talking about what effects it might have without kind of being a doom and gloom. This is going to be awful. You're going to feel terrible when it's over. Person may feel quite relieved, actually, at the end of a telling or end of a part 2 structured questionnaire. But it's building in ahead of time some resources. And so talking to the person about, are there going to be people around, images or internal resources that the person might have. What are some things you can do to help calm yourself? Some people may use spiritual resources. Some may, do pleasant activities. Some may be around people and so forth. But having a very explicit conversation about what is a self-care plan, essentially, for you as we go through what might be kind of a difficult process. And so in the second bullet, some ways to reframe some of the questions are simply, what happened to me? And how did it change me? Maybe some more common sense ways of talking about their trauma histories without it sounding so foreboding, if you will. And finally, how did the law enforcement help or not help, I suppose, as well. So in the phase 2, again, the goal is to elaborate on the story. The standardized tools help do that in ways that the open-ended questionnaires, questioning in the interview often does not. And then from a healing perspective, the exposure of reading and rereading the story, which is in part what needs to happen anyway to get the petition right, to get it complete. Not that it's edited for grammar or good storytelling, but that it represents the real story. It's part of what's important from a healing perspective. And providing lots of opportunities to validate that this is a difficult process, that this is important, that people need to know this, that your story is of value. And it's not any wonder that you would feel a lot of emotion when you revisit this story. All those are very important. So just quickly here to overview a couple of examples of some standardized tools. Some of you may know of these already, that assess essentially the question of what happened to me. What was my trauma exposure is really what this is about. There are measures that look at a whole breadth of types of different traumas, again, as more of a way of providing a context. There are quite a number of measures that can be used to assess domestic violence, partner violence, both for physical abuse, psychological abuse, coercion, the danger assessment scale. Some of you may be using that to assess how much actual danger is the person currently in at the moment. And then a kind of trauma that referred to as indigenous trauma, kind of the kind of traumatic effects of ongoing oppression or discrimination based on being a class, particular class, an immigrant, certain racial ethnic groups, things that the person encounters on a day-to-day basis that people talk about in terms of the intersectionality, but those kinds of experiences are important to weave in as well. What are some tools for assessing how did it change me? Well, certainly you want to get that story in part one, but in part two, we can get much more specific about types of effects. So in terms of fear and threat appraisal, in terms of mental health effects like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, those kinds of follow-up standardized tools can be helpful in really honing in and identifying specific kinds of effects, but also could potentially be used in the affidavit to strengthen it if one were able to say, for example, that there's evidence that this person is actually experiencing certain effects relative to, a normative group. And finally, in part two, if one were assessing using a structured questionnaire that simply asks, did this happen, did this happen, did this happen, very structured way, those provide opportunities to elaborate on now a more narrative telling of, here's a question that says, have you ever had a gun or a knife pointed at you? Well, that maybe didn't come up in part one, but it's checked off or it's answered yes in part two. And so that provides an opportunity to say, oh, well, I forgot about all those times. Or, yeah, that's, I didn't mention that. That becomes a very important piece of information. I think I mentioned that. And then let's go back to discussion.
I think skip the discussion because of time. I think we can move on. I want to be sure we have time to cover me and working with clients in crisis. Ladies?
Okay. Okay, one of the things, how do we use the intervention method, part 3? We integrate the survivor story with information from the structured interview. So you integrate the information that you've gotten from the other documents that you read, the police report, everything else, as well as the interview and the tool that has been provided. We create one narrative, and that's when we put that in chronological order. Because while we're working with the survivor and developing the story, we're not putting it into chronological order. We're letting them develop the story in their own way. And then we do the editing and we put it into chronological order so that it's more understandable, so that it flows, and so that it provides the information that we need to prove the elements of our case. With the survivor and the advocate, or the survivor and the attorney, review the story. You can do this in different ways. You can either have the survivor read the story back to you if they feel comfortable doing that, if they feel ready to do that, or you can read it with them and see. They may also, at this point, decide that there are other things that they want to add, or other events that they remembered or that they recalled that they may want to add to the story. You may be able to refine it at this point. And then you collaborate together on all parts of this process. We've done that when working with the advocate. We've done that in working with the therapist and the survivor. So there are different ways to do this, and it can be done just your relationship with the survivor. And so as long as you work together to create this story, it will be an effective story, and it will be impactful, and it will make your case stronger.
Leona, I'm going to take this one, if I may. Marianne?
Absolutely.
Marianne, can you describe how, from a trauma-informed perspective, why the client reading her story to the lawyer as opposed to the lawyer reading the story to the client, what the benefits of one of those approaches or the others would be from a trauma-informed perspective?
Well, reading it to someone else, the survivor reading it to someone else, makes it your own. And having it read back to you, although perhaps powerful as well, allows for a bit of emotional distance. So either could be helpful, but if both options are available, having the client read it back, I think has more of the processes that one would think of as healing, and it also provides the opportunity for the listener, the interviewer, the attorney, to hold the story, to validate the story, to be attentive, witness, all things that are important in the healing process.
Great. And just one of the questions we got that I want to be sure to tell you is to reiterate that the outline that Marianne gave earlier of those tools and follow-up questions, we will have available to you in the next couple of months. I think the idea is that by using the tools that Marianne outlined, you'll have an opportunity to delve into areas using tools that researchers have found to be effective in discovering essentially domestic violence, sexual assault, trauma from a research perspective, and ideally help that information come out sooner in the process so that the client is addressing these issues and trying to heal from, I guess you could say, the whole of the trauma she's experienced up to that point. And from a lawyer's perspective, it provides, and Mercedes, maybe you can comment on this a little bit more, it provides, I think, more depth and credibility to the story that will hopefully lead to a better outcome in the immigration case. Mercedes?
Absolutely. It will make the case more credible, but aside from that, it also will help you clear inconsistencies. And so sometimes we've seen that in police reports, the officer will write down that the survivor said something. But while talking about, while working and developing the story, you can explain why certain inconsistencies were noted in the report. And so this is a way to also make the case clearer. It will give you it will even give you as an attorney a better understanding of the case and what you're doing.
Can everybody please hit star, or how do you mute your phones, Leona? Somebody's got their phone unmuted.
You press *6 to mute your line. I think they may have just muted it. So.
Great. So thank you, Mercedes. So now what I'm going to do very quickly before am I back in? Okay, hold on. What I'm going to do very quickly is just highlight for the immigration lawyers and the advocates who have done these cases before the types of areas of the immigration cases where we believe this approach will really enhance the quality of the affidavits and the stories you're getting. It's going to help with proof of battery and extreme cruelty. It's going to help improve the credibility of the story on paper for the adjudicators. It's going to help victims, perhaps if you have a victim who fought back, who needs a domestic violence victim waiver, help with proof of good moral character, help with obtaining various inadmissibility waivers. The stronger the emotional, how would I say this, the emotional impact of the case, of the story, being able to broaden it using these tools can help in those ways. In a U visa case, it's going to help with not only the credibility of the description of the criminal activity, but will also help particularly in proving substantial harm, which is super important and critical in the U visa case, and will help
election day.
Help victims get inadmissibility waivers, and help victims who chose that who felt it was not safe to cooperate to be able to get lawful permanent residency and prove that their choice to cooperate was not unreasonable. In the T visa case, it's going to help with the credibility and the determination of severe forms of human trafficking, why a person was enslaved and whether they were unable to leave. It's going to help with the climate, describing questions about the climate of fear surrounding their captivity, and help with proof of extreme and unusual hardship, as well as, similarly to the other ones, good moral character and inadmissibility waivers. So Marianne, I'm going to turn this over to you in terms of strengthening people's ability to support survivors in the process.
Okay, I'll try to be quick here, but the point really about this is that for the advocate, one has to take care of one's own self as a tool in this process, or it won't really be terribly effective, or you won't sort of last very long as an effective tool. So being aware of one's own emotional reactions to the stories as you're hearing them, which really means that one has to do one's own work to identify one's own raw spots from our own trauma histories or our own life stories, so that we can be prepared when those stories come at us from our clients. Pacing ourselves, taking breaks, preparing for sessions, not rushing from one session to the other, to the other, to the other. I know logistically sometimes that feels impossible, but even taking 5 minutes in between to sort of cleanse, relax, care, let go of what has come before to prepare essentially as a container for the next client can be really helpful. How do we then help survivors in this process who come into crisis or who are just feeling stressed by this whole process? And so I think of this as really two categories of things. Techniques that one can use in the session because you need to right then, and then the emotional safety plan of what can clients do once they're home to help de-stress, to help survive. So techniques that can be used right in the session could be considered within the category of grounding techniques, self-regulation. It could be helping the client just focus on his or her breath, grounding oneself in the awareness that they're in this room with you. Their feet are on the floor. They can feel their hands on the chair. They can look you in the eye, or if that's too difficult, they can look at an object in the room and ground themselves that they're here now. They're not there then. And those kinds of techniques that are very concrete, very here and now, become very, very important just to bring the person back to the now. As for techniques that can be used at home, it really depends on one's own interest. For some people, it may be gardening. For others, it's playing the piano. For others, it's playing a guitar, dancing, being with their children, taking a walk, things that intentionally help to regulate the emotion as it's inevitably coming up. So the goals of the trauma-informed approach to these applications is to help develop, as I said before, a coherent narrative of the client's abusive relationship and crime victimization experiences depending on the application, to include the life trauma exposure as part of the context, and to specifically get a lot of detail about the trauma history, the crime victimization history, which is specifically a trauma history, that's specifically needed for the application. It's really important to recognize the client as a whole human being. The trauma is only part of their story. They're not trauma. It's just a part of their story. We need to support the client in their own need and desire often to self-regulate. We need to understand the client's behavior, even as it's exhibited toward us through a trauma lens, so their anger, their frustration, their withdrawal, their any kind of reaction has to be understood through their experience. We have to be able to help titrate the client's exposure so that we go, as Mercedes says, at their pace, not ours. We need to recognize the impact of exposing them, re-exposing them to their own trauma histories, their own stories. We, as I said just a minute ago, use the techniques for grounding and soothing. The voice becomes an incredibly powerful tool. We can use the voice to soothe in the moment. That can be really powerful. Validating completing the process, which just could be completing the story in that day. Validating successes, accomplishments, and achievements. And of course, if someone seems to need it and or wants it, referral to other trauma resources that might exist. And I'll, in my part, I think, excuse me, here with a real pitch for self-care for you, the advocate, the attorney, the counselor. These are kind of like the ABCs of self-care, or the basic ingredients of good care: physical activity, enough sleep and rest, good nutrition, supportive, nurturing relationships, and then tending the mind through self-reflection and internal dialogue, and calming, mindful, non-judgmental holding of our own experience all become very important in doing this work well.
So at this point, we've been noting some of the questions that people have been asking in the chat, and what I thought we'd do is, in concluding, is try to address a couple of them. Marianne, just very briefly, does gender affect whether you can do this work? Can women and men do it equally? Does it matter?
Well, it may matter for an individual client, but as a whole, men and women who can hold this emotional material, provide a soothing, emotionally supportive, validating container to build the story, can do that equally well. That said, an individual client may come in with a pre-expectation that she could never tell the story to, and then fill in the blank. But in general, this is an equal opportunity activity.
Wonderful. And then the other point I wanted to make before closing in response to one of the questions is that there was a question about whether there's a problem with confidentiality and collaboration. Are there issues with confidentiality when you're collaborating across discipline? And what I can tell you is we can get you more on that in the next webinar. We're actually working with a law firm that there is a way that we are working on that would extend attorney-client privilege to advocates that are collaborating with lawyers on these cases. And so that'll be upcoming in the future. But generally speaking, you want to be aware of what confidentiality protections each profession may have and try to be careful about that. But we have like 2 minutes left, and so I want to end with talking to you about what we have available. Again, the materials here are at the Go link for the trauma materials. We have other materials in our web library. Marianne did a session on trauma at our Providence conference, and there's some other materials available there. There's a whole library of materials available on immigrant victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And most importantly, we have technical assistance available. It shouldn't say law enforcement. This is the slide. There was an error in the slide. We have technical assistance available to advocates and attorneys and therapists doing this work. That technical assistance both includes help with the legal cases, and we can make Marianne Dutton and Giselle Haas with our OVW funding available. If you have questions, or you're doing this work and you have questions about how to work with trauma, we can, with our OVW funding, make that resource available to you too. We provide, these are some of the primary national technical assistance providers, the materials we have available and that are available from Assista and other organizations. So we are at 3:30, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. We will keep you we will send out materials about the next webinar that will address these issues in more depth. Marianne will speak more fully on at that second webinar on using these particular trauma intervention research tools, but also on intervening with clients who go into crisis and some techniques for that. So thank you very much for joining us. Leona?
Thank you all. And speakers, please call into the line that we used to debrief this morning.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.